Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we are diving into a really fascinating and, let's be honest, pretty contentious topic, the Sharia State. Now, it's a phrase that gets thrown around all the time, but what does it actually mean? Well, that's at the heart of a huge debate, so let's get right into it. So, this is the big question we're wrestling with today. Is the whole idea of a state governed by Sharia law something that's been around for 14 centuries, a core part of the tradition? Or is it actually a pretty recent political invention? You're going to find that the answer really depends on who you talk to. Okay, so let's explore the first side of this argument, the idea that the Islamic State, as we imagine it now, is actually a totally modern concept, that it's a huge break from how things were done for most of Islamic history. This quote from the scholar Wael Halak really hits the nail on the head. What he's saying is, look, the modern nation-state, with its constitutions, parliaments, and massive legal systems, it's a whole different animal. And when you try to force Sharia into that box, you don't empower it, you actually trap it. You make it a tool of the state in a way it just never was for over 1,000 years.
So this whole thesis kind of boils down to a historical separation of powers. The argument goes that this modern idea of a government creating and enforcing religious law, well, it's basically an import, copied from European state models. Historically, you see, rulers and caliphs didn't write the law. That was the job of the fuqaha, the independent jurists and scholars. They were the ones interpreting sacred texts, and Sharia grew organically from society itself, not as a top-down decree from the state.
But is that really the full picture? This is where the other side of the debate comes in, and they argue that this first view is based on a really narrow idea of what establishing Sharia even means.
And honestly, this question is the key that unlocks the whole thing, because if establishing Sharia is just about passing legislation, then yeah, maybe the first argument makes sense. But what if it's about something way bigger than that?
Because when you look at it traditionally, Sharia isn't just a book of laws. It's an entire ecosystem. It's a blueprint for a way of life that covers everything: faith, worship, ethics, business, you name it. So if you only see it as a set of rules a government enforces, you're missing a huge part of the picture. And that bigger picture is absolutely crucial for the counter-argument.
This breakdown right here really clarifies that historical dynamic. A scholar from way back in the 14th century, Ibn Jama'ah, he laid out these two distinct but connected roles. On one side, you have the preservers. These are the scholars, the experts. Their job is to interpret, study, and protect the knowledge of Sharia. Then you have the protectors. These are the rulers and kings. Their job is to take the principles defined by the scholars and actually put them into practice in society. So it's not a separation, it's a partnership.
So if the rulers weren't making the law, what were they doing? Well, this is where we get into the historical evidence, which suggests there was actually a really deep structural connection between the power of the state and the day-to-day application of Sharia.
Let's start with the justice system. I mean, think about it. A judge can make a ruling, right? But he can't enforce it by himself. You need police to make arrests, prisons to hold people, officials to run the courts. All of that is state infrastructure. And we see this throughout history. Caliphs appointed judges themselves, and they even set up special high courts for major grievances. The whole system was completely dependent on the authority and the resources of the state.
And it's the exact same story with the economy. It was the caliph, the head of state, who was responsible for collecting things like zakat, the charity tax, and other forms of revenue according to Sharia principles. In fact, one of the most famous books on Islamic economics was written by Imam Abu Yusuf specifically because the caliph asked him to. The state treasury wasn't just a bank, it was an active tool for implementing Sharia's economic vision.
Now check this out. In the marketplace, the state appointed an official called the muhtasib. You can think of him as a market inspector, but with way more power. His job was to make sure scales were fair, to stop fraud, and to uphold public morality. And here's the kicker. He had the authority, backed by the state, to punish people right on the spot. I mean, this is about as clear an example as you can get of the state actively enforcing Sharia in public life.
And this quote from a 12th century scholar just says it all, doesn't it? The very idea of separating religion from the state would have seemed bizarre. To him, the state's survival was completely tied to its role as the protector and implementer of the faith. So when you pull all this evidence together, the courts, the economy, the marketplace, a totally different picture starts to take shape. And from this viewpoint, the modern call for a Sharia state isn't some strange new invention at all. It's seen as just continuing a very old, very central principle, that the state has a vital role to play in upholding Sharia.
And here's where the argument does a complete 180.
The claim becomes that the people who are the real innovators are the critics. By trying to push Sharia out of the state and into the private social sphere, they're the ones who are presenting a new, modern, and maybe even a secularized version of Islamic history.
So, the final conclusion from this side of the debate is pretty straightforward. That connection between political authority and Sharia isn't some recent idea. It's actually a core, integral part of a legal and political tradition that stretches all the way back to the beginning.
But, hold on. And this is a really, really big but. Just because something is a historical tradition doesn't mean the goal is to just, copy and paste the past into the present. And this is where the debate gets its final and maybe its most important layer of complexity. Because if you look closely, the tradition was never static. It was always adapting. Islamic political thought evolved to meet new realities. The first ideal was one unified state. But when that wasn't possible anymore, scholars found ways to legitimize multiple states. Heck, even seizing power by force, once considered a major crime, was eventually accepted out of sheer necessity to prevent total chaos. The political model was always changing.
And that brings us to what might be the real heart of the matter. The true living tradition isn't about perfectly recreating a specific government from the 8th or 12th century. It's about the methodology, using the foundational principles and legal tools of the tradition to grapple with the problems of today. The form can change, but the principles and the process of applying them, that's what endures.
And so we're left with this final, powerful question. It's not a simple yes or no anymore, is it? If the real tradition is all about adapting timeless principles to new challenges, then the big question for today isn't about rebuilding the past. It's about figuring out how those principles ought to guide us in the complex, messy, modern world we actually live in. Thanks so much for joining me.